Smoke from the last of the barbecue still clung to the air when my grandson muttered, "You're worth nothing now," pushing away his plate under the hum of a flickering fluorescent light. I'm Garrison Thane 61, a retired auditor gripping the smooth, intact blue folder by my chair. Ever had one dinner comment make you question everything while hiding a secret they'll never see coming? Late autumn in Michigan has a way of settling into your bones before you even step outside. The kind of cold that seeps through the walls, lingers in the corners, and makes you notice every draft that sneaks under a door. Claret's dining room, with its yellow lights and heavy curtains, tried to push back the chill, but there was something in the air that even warmth couldn't reach. The smell of charcoal from the afternoon's barbecue still hung faintly, mixing with the steam from a pot of spiced cider on the counter. It felt like home, or at least like the version of home I used to know, before words sharper than the wind came to hang in the air. Orrin shoved his plate forward, a half-eaten slice of brisket, sliding against the porcelain, and muttered it without so much as looking up. "You're worth nothing now." His voice had that blend of casual cruelty and careless confidence I used to hear in junior analysts at the firm. Men who thought the world would fold for them simply because they were young and loud enough. The smoke of the barbecue caught in my throat as I looked at him, but I didn't answer. I've learned that silence held long enough is heavier than any retort. Claret laughed nervously, the rim of her wineglass trembling slightly as she lifted it. "Orrin, don't talk like that." Her smile faltered for a heartbeat when her eyes flicked toward me, something uneasy flickering there before she looked away. Nevin, as usual, didn't bother to join the performance. He scrolled through his phone thumb, flicking the screen, the soft hum of a notification breaking through the clinking of silverware. He always wears a suit even to dinner, as if he's perpetually one phone call away from a boardroom. Maybe he is. Or maybe it's just another way to remind everyone at the table who's really pulling the strings. I didn't let my face show much. A slight nod, a slow cut of the remaining roast on my plate, the careful way I chewed each bite, while Orrin smirked and leaned back like he'd said something clever. My thoughts, as they often do these days, drifted to Celeste. She would have known what to say. She had that way of laughing at arrogance, slicing it down without anyone feeling the sting until hours later. She'd probably have reached across the table, patted my hand, and whispered something like, "Let the boy feel big, Gary. He doesn't know how small he sounds." But the chair beside me was empty, as it had been for years now, and the only sound I heard was the faint rattle of wind against the kitchen window. I let the conversation carry on without me, Claret asking Orrin about his classes, Nevin finally chiming in with a few comments about internships and contacts he could line up for him. I just sat there nodding, where polite fingers brushing against the worn leather of my briefcase by the chair. Inside, sealed and untouched, was a blue folder no one at that table had ever seen. They all assumed I'd dwindled into some soft, irrelevant retiree, a man with nothing left to offer but quiet sighs and old stories. Maybe they needed to believe that. The cider pot hissed softly on the counter. Condensation collected and rolled down the sides of Claret's wineglass, leaving a small wet ring on the table. The smell of smoke and grilled meat clung to my sweater even as the plates were cleared. Orrin was laughing now, talking about some vacation he was planning with friends, while Nevin leaned back, the glow of his phone lighting his jawline as he checked another notification. Claret's laughter sounded more like something practiced than anything she felt. I wondered if they even noticed I hadn't spoken more than a handful of words the entire evening. Eventually, I stood adjusting my coat with a calm slowness that felt heavier than the situation warranted. "I'll get going," I said, voice level. Claret blinked at me like she'd forgotten I was still at the table. Orrin just shrugged, and Nevin muttered a distracted, "Drive safe," without lifting his eyes. As I reached for my coat, my hand brushed the smooth leather of the briefcase and the edge of that blue folder inside. It was intact, pristine, untouched by their assumptions. Outside, the cold bit at my cheeks the moment I stepped off the porch. The driveway was quiet, lined with a few bare maples that creaked softly in the breeze. My breath fogged in the air as I made my way to my car, the faint light from the dining room window spilling across the hood. I paused before opening the door, letting the silence of the night settle around me. Their laughter, muffled through the walls, reached me as a dull, distant echo. "They'll know my worth." I whispered the words tasting like frost and something almost sweet as they left my lips, but not the way they expect. My fingers tightened briefly on the car door handle, the leather of my gloves creaking in the stillness. The briefcase rested on the passenger seat as I slid behind the wheel, the faint scent of charcoal and cider still clinging to me. The engine turned over with a low hum, headlights carving a path through the suburban dark, and I drove away without looking back at the house. The walls of Dorian Pell's office seemed to hold the weight of time itself, lined with dark wood panels, polished to a soft sheen, their grain catching the faint morning light, sneaking through narrow blinds. The room smelled faintly of roasted coffee and old paper. Not the sharp scent of fresh ink and toner, but something that had lived in drawers and files for decades. The printer hummed quietly in the corner like a patient metronome, keeping us all on edge. Dorian leaned back in his chair, glasses perched low on his nose as he flipped through the stack of documents. His fingers, long and deliberate, moved with the same rhythm they had when I first met him in the mid-90s, back when he was reviewing corporate audits, and I was the one saving our firm from a fraud scandal no one else could see. "Are you sure about this, Garrison?" His voice carried the steadiness of a man who had seen 1,000 last-minute doubts from clients, his tone neither pressing nor soft, just present. "Once this is filed, there's no quiet undoing," I'm sure I said, though I felt the faintest tremor in my hands as I steadied the pen over the line. The office camera clicked once in the background, capturing the moment for the legal record. The sound echoed louder in my mind than it should have, a reminder that every stroke I made today would ripple forward far past the four walls of this room. My thumb brushed over the edge of the page, lingering for a heartbeat on the bold heading at the top, Celeste Thane Community Fund. The name tightened my throat in ways I didn't care to explain, not even to Dorian. I flipped the page before the young clerk behind the copier could notice the way my expression shifted. The pen felt heavier than it should have, but I pressed it down, the ink flowing in measured strokes. Each signature felt like a small release, as though I was unclenching a hand that had been gripping too tightly for too long. The camera clicked again, softer this time, and the printer continued its gentle hum, filling the spaces where neither Dorian nor I felt the need to speak. He knew I wasn't a man for ceremony, and I knew he wasn't a man to offer comfort I hadn't asked for. The young clerk, no older than 22 by my guess, shuffled nervously near the copier, tapping his fingers against the edge of the tray, while the machine spat out notarized copies. The tapping synced up with the printer's hum, a staccato beat that felt out of place in this measured process. He caught my eye once, then looked away quickly, as if afraid to meet the gaze of someone who might hold his future paycheck in his hands. It reminded me of the first time I ever signed something binding in a boardroom. Young, nervous, trying to look anywhere but into the eyes of the people who could decide whether I rose or fell. When the last page was signed, Dorian closed the folder gently, his fingers lingering over the label for a moment before sliding it across the desk. The blue folder, its edges unmarked and its surface unmarred, looked almost too clean, like it didn't belong in a world of fingerprints and smudges. With a steady hand, Dorian carried it across the room and placed it into the safe built into the wall. The metallic click as the door locked echoed like a closing statement in a courtroom final, unyielding, impossible to mistake for anything else. We sat in silence for a few moments. The hum of the printer had stopped, leaving only the faint creak of the old radiator in the corner. Outside, I could hear the distant honk of traffic on Jefferson Avenue, muffled through the layers of walls and blinds. My phone buzzed against the wood of the conference table, the sound sharp enough to make the young clerk jump slightly. I turned the screen over, expecting some automated alert, but instead found a single line from an anonymous sender: "Nevin's talking about selling your house. More soon." The glow of the screen lit up the grain of the table beneath it. My reflection ghosted faintly in the black glass edges. Dorian was still flipping through his own copy of the paperwork, unfazed, while the clerk busied himself stacking the extra pages into a neat pile. I kept my thumb hovering over the screen, not replying, just staring at the words. My jaw tightened as I set the phone down and let my hand rest beside it. "They're not wasting time, are they?" I muttered, my voice low enough that it almost vanished beneath the creak of the radiator. Neither Dorian nor the clerk looked up, but I caught the briefest nod from Dorian, a silent agreement that what I'd suspected was no longer just paranoia. The lights above flickered slightly as the heating system kicked in, casting a faint shadow over the framed certificate on the wall, a plaque from the Detroit Chamber of Commerce, commemorating a firm Dorian and I had once saved from collapse together. I stared at it for a moment, remembering how different things had been when Celeste was still here to smile at those victories to tell me, "It's not about the applause, Gary. It's about knowing you held the line when no one else would." I slipped the phone back into my jacket pocket, stood and buttoned the coat with deliberate precision. The room smelled faintly of old coffee, the kind that clings to everything long after the pot's been drained. Outside, the wind would be sharp against my face, colder even than it had been last night, but it didn't bother me. I had work to do, and the folder safely locked behind Dorian's polished wood panels was the first stone laid on a path none of them could see coming yet. The folding chairs creaked as neighbors shifted in their seats, the sound mingling with the faint scrape of shoes on the scuffed linoleum floor. The air in the community center meeting room carried that lingering scent of stale coffee and floor polish, a smell I'd come to associate with long discussions and half-hearted compromises. A ceiling fan clicked unevenly overhead, stirring the papers on the folding tables and pushing the August heat into reluctant swirls. Through the low hum of chatter, Nevin's voice cut clean, rising just enough to silence the room without seeming like he'd forced it. "Selling Garrison's property," he said, drawing out my name as if it were an obstacle he'd already calculated into the plan, could help fund the town's PTA drive. It's centrally located, it's sizable, and frankly, it's been underused for years. His tone oozed confidence, every word coated in the smooth varnish he used in his banking presentations. But I saw his fingers drumming against the tabletop, tapping a quiet, erratic rhythm. Across the room, Claret stood near the back wall, arms crossed her nails, tracing the edge of her elbow, as if she were trying to keep herself from speaking. She kept her gaze low, only glancing at me when someone mentioned community goodwill. When the talk turned to how the PTA could use a sale to bolster its public image, her hands fidgeted, wringing the hem of her blouse. Her mouth formed a whisper when Nevin leaned toward her, and I caught enough to understand. If this doesn't pass, we're stuck. Debts. We'll look like we're clinging Nevin. Her words weren't meant for me, but they floated just enough through the shuffle of papers and coughs to settle where they shouldn't have. Dorian, seated beside me with his back straight and tie perfectly centered, leaned just slightly, his voice barely audible. "Don't bite yet, Gary," he murmured, using that nickname only Celeste and he ever did. His eyes didn't leave the documents in front of him as he adjusted his tie, the smallest motion signaling what I already knew. "Stay patient. Let the room reveal itself before we make a move. Document everything. You've played this game before, just quieter now." I watched Nevin pace slowly at the front, pivoting near the whiteboard as he gestured toward mock-up charts showing community benefits. The markers squeaked faintly as he circled numbers, selling the room on the inevitability of progress. The murmurs around me shifted, some nods, some uneasy glances. The smell of burnt coffee from a forgotten pot in the corner grew sharper, bitter in the warm air. Quietly, I slid my phone from my pocket under the table. The screen dimmed and pressed the record button. The faint vibration as it began to capture the audio was almost imperceptible. I angled it just enough so its microphone pointed toward the front, catching Nevin's polished voice as he laid out terms that sounded generous on the surface, but would, I knew, leave me cut out of decisions entirely. Each time his tone grew silkier, his fingers betrayed him, fidgeting, tapping, betraying the nerves beneath the performance. Claret whispered again this time, her voice low but audible in the lull between Nevin's points. "We can't let this fall through. PTA needs this win, for us as much as the school." Her eyes didn't meet mine, though I could feel the weight of the words brush against me like the stale air in the room. The meeting stretched on with the predictable back and forth, some questioning the ethics, others nodding along, because Nevin always managed to sound like a man doing the community a favor, rather than himself. I didn't speak once. I just sat still as the rows of folding chairs, my eyes tracking the twitch of Nevin's jaw. Each time someone asked who would profit from the deal after expenses. When it finally adjourned, the scrape of chairs against the floor was louder than the voices, everyone eager to escape the humid fluorescent-lit room. Dorian and I slipped out into the evening air, which felt cool against the lingering heat inside. A flickering streetlight cast uneven shadows across the cracked pavement as we walked toward our cars, its hum blending with the faint sound of crickets from the patch of grass nearby. "The board may side with them," Dorian said quietly, his hands in his coat pockets, voice low enough that it didn't travel beyond the halo of light. "They've got the PTA goodwill narrative and Nevin knows how to polish his pitch. But timing's everything. If we're careful, we can turn their momentum against them." I looked back toward the glowing windows of the community center, shadows moving behind the blinds as the last few volunteers stacked chairs. The faint buzz of the streetlight and the smell of dust and cut grass grounded me in the moment. My phone still warm in my pocket from the recording felt heavier than it should have. Timing, I echoed my voice almost blending with the hum above us, and patience. I can manage that. The light flickered once more as a gust of wind rustled the leaves above us, and I glanced at Dorian. He didn't need to say more. His slight nod was enough. Together we stepped off the cracked sidewalk, each of us already thinking 3 moves ahead, the cool air sharpening the edges of our resolve. Candlelight flickered across Claret's dining room, throwing long, soft shadows against the cream-colored walls and making the polished surface of the table gleam like a mirror. Outside, the winter wind clawed at the windows, rattling the panes just enough to remind me how cold it had become beyond those walls. The roast chicken on my plate was cool to the touch. Now its skin dulled a thin slick of congealed fat, catching the light from the taper candles. The room smelled faintly of rosemary and wax, but neither was strong enough to mask the tension that had settled over the evening. Navan, seated across from me with his usual perfect posture, used 2 fingers to nudge the blue folder toward me. The leather cover rasped softly against the table as it slid the sound as sharp as the words that followed. "Just paper, Garrison," he said, his voice, all calm reason on the surface, though the faintly smug tilt of his mouth betrayed more. Time to be realistic. His cufflinks caught the candlelight with a polished glint as he folded his hands together, leaning back, as though this entire conversation were routine business, instead of what it was, an ambush disguised as care. I let my fingers rest on the folder's edge, tracing the smooth leather until they found the small tear at one corner, rough against my skin. The damage hadn't been there before Nevin's shove, and though it was barely visible, it felt like a bruise I couldn't quite see. Claret sipped from her wine-glass, eyes fixed on the flickering flame rather than on me. The muted clink of the glass meeting the table filled the pause that stretched out before she spoke, her voice soft, tentative. Maybe it's for the best, Dad. You'd be comfortable. People would see you cared about the community, not clinging to a big empty house while the PTA scrambles for space." Her words floated like a draft, more suggestion than conviction, but enough to sting. Oren sat at the far end, thumbs moving in a steady rhythm over his phone, the glow of the screen lighting his expressionless face. He hadn't looked up once, not when Nevin spoke, not when Claret murmured her hesitant agreement, not when the folder slid across the table, as though the last vestige of my independence could be shifted so easily from one side to the other. The faint clicking of his phone was just one more sound layered over the soft crackle of the fireplace and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. Nevin's tone shifted, dipping into something meant to sound reassuring, but landing just this side of patronizing. "You'd have no worries, Gary. Full care, no upkeep, no drafts sneaking under the doors at night. You could finally relax instead of rattling around in that place. Let the PTA put the property to good use." He folded his hands atop the table thumbs, brushing over each other in a controlled, deliberate motion that told me he'd rehearsed this pitch more than once. I didn't answer. My gaze stayed on the tear at the corner of the folder, the smallest imperfection in something I had kept untouched, sealed safe. Celeste's voice drifted to the surface of my thoughts, not in words so much as in that calm, steady tone she used when life tilted off balance. "Stand tall, Gary," she would have said, the same way she had after my first failed audit pitch, after my last long night at the firm, after each of life's smaller humiliations. Some things aren't worth fighting, but the ones that are. You'll know. The warmth from the candles couldn't reach me then, not really. The rosemary and wax and wine all felt distant, like props in a room I didn't quite belong to anymore. The muted hum of the refrigerator down the hall filled the silence as I pushed my chair back, its legs scraping softly against the wood floor. I folded the folder with care, fingers smoothing its torn edge as though my touch could erase the damage, and tucked it under my arm. No words for Claret, none for Nevin, not even for Oren, who didn't look up from his phone as I moved toward the hallway. My coat hung by the door, cold to the touch, as I slipped it on the faint smell of outside clinging to the wool. The chill that swept in when I opened the door bit at my cheeks sharper even than the words I'd just endured. I didn't look back at the dining room, at the candles still burning, at Claret staring into her glass, or Nevin adjusting his cufflinks as if preparing for his next negotiation. In the car, the heater ticked softly as it began to warm, casting a faint orange glow across the dashboard. I opened my laptop on the passenger seat, its screen lighting the dark interior with a pale glow. The cursor blinked at the top of a draft email, already queued in my outbox, addressed to Dorian Pell. No greeting, no sign-off, just 3 words. Phase 2 begins. My finger hovered over the touchpad for a beat, feeling the quiet thrum of the engine beneath me, the faint whistle of the wind slipping through the car's frame. Outside, the driveway lay empty save for the bare trees lining its edge, their branches swaying gently in the winter air. I pressed send. The soft whoosh of the email leaving matched the exhale. I hadn't realized I'd been holding a thin plume of breath fogging the inside of the windshield as I leaned back and closed the laptop. The folder rested beside it, its torn corner catching the dim dashboard light, a silent reminder of everything that had been pushed across that polished table. I stared at it for a moment, listening to the heater's soft hum, then shifted the car into gear. The tires crunched lightly over the salted pavement as I eased out of the drive, the glow from Claret's dining room fading behind me until the night swallowed it whole. The Willow Street Cafe still smelled the way it always had, like warm cinnamon old wood polished one too many times, and faint traces of espresso that clung to the rafters long after the machines went quiet. The place hadn't changed much since the late 80s, save for a new coat of paint, and the way the neon sign outside now buzzed when the wind hit it right. It was the kind of corner spot only people with a long memory still came to, tucked between a shuttered shoe repair shop and a barber shop that hadn't updated its signage since before I retired. Celeste and I used to sit here every Saturday morning for years, tucked into the same corner booth by the window, sipping coffee and watching the city wake up. She once told me, her fingers curled around her cup, "This is where you learn who someone really is, Gary. Not in a boardroom, not at a holiday dinner here over coffee when no one's looking." Dorian slid a thick envelope across the table, now the paper's edge brushing against the old grain of the wood with a whisper-soft rasp. "It's time, Garrison." He said, his voice low, measured with none of the softness people mistake for comfort. His glasses caught the pale morning light filtering through the streaked window, a thin glint over his otherwise shadowed face. "Let's put the pieces in motion." His hand, steady as ever, stayed on his side of the table after the envelope landed in front of me. He knew I didn't need pushing, not anymore. Between us sat a chipped ceramic mug, Celeste's old one, its pale surface carefully patched with golden glue. Nora, the cafe's owner, and someone who had watched us claim this booth for decades, had brought it out without a word when I walked in. "Thought you'd like it back," she'd murmured before retreating to the counter, leaving the mug with a quiet reverence. I traced the gold seams with my fingertips, feeling the faint ridges where it had once broken. A part of me thought it should have stayed broken, a relic left to memory, but seeing it pieced together stronger for its scars steadied something in me I hadn't realized was shaking. Dorian tapped the envelope lightly with one finger, bringing me back to the task at hand. "The Celeste Thane Community Fund is finalized. All we need now is your signature and the date for the family meeting. We'll call it an estate review. Let them think it's about simplifying things before the inevitable. But we'll set the terms, not them." He leaned back, his chair creaking faintly, his posture the picture of quiet confidence. "I've also drafted a conditional clause. Nevin gets his share only if he agrees to direct community service for 2 years. It's legal, ironclad. He'll hate it, but he won't be able to contest it." The cafe door opened briefly, letting in a slice of cold spring air and the muffled sound of traffic outside. A man in a worn coat shuffled past us toward the counter, nodding once before ordering his coffee. I slid the envelope closer, the weight of it grounding me more than it intimidated. Inside were months of careful planning, Dorian's steady hand on the legal strings, my deliberate choices about where every cent of my legacy would go, and the assurance that none of them, Nevin with his smug efficiency, Claret with her worried concessions, Orrin with his careless tongue, would see it coming until the ink was dry. I flipped the envelope open and began reviewing the top sheet. The fund charter bore Celeste's name in clean lettering at the top. Something that pulled at me more than I'd anticipated. My hand stilled on the paper, and for a moment the murmur of the cafe faded. I thought of her sitting across from me here, stirring sugar into her coffee with that patient rhythm, laughing softly at some half-joke. I'd mumbled about retirement dreams we never quite got to live. "Don't ever let them make you small, Gary," she'd said once when a client had tried to cut me down in a meeting. "You're quiet, not weak. Remember the difference." Nora passed by again, refilling our cups without a word. The aroma of the fresh pour curled into the air, warm and grounding as Dorian slid a pen across to me. "It's your move," he said simply. My fingers curled around the pen, steadier now than they had been in months. The gold seams of Celeste's mug caught the light as I lowered the tip to the page and signed my name with deliberate strokes. The scratch of ink against paper was soft, but it felt loud in my chest, each letter an anchor setting my course. When the final line was signed, Dorian tucked the papers back into the envelope, sealed it with a firm press, and placed it into his briefcase. The latch clicked shut with the same surety as the safe had years ago, a sound that felt like another door locking behind us, keeping the path ahead clear. We left the cafe together, the bell above the door chiming a soft farewell. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain on pavement. The street was quiet, save for the faint buzz of the flickering neon sign and the distant whoosh of a bus passing by. As we walked toward our cars, a flyer pinned to a nearby utility pole caught my eye. A mentorship program for local teens, bold letters promising a pathway to purpose. Orrin's face flickered in my mind, his restless energy, his careless words at Claret's table. For the first time in a while, I felt something beyond resolve, a thin strand of hope threading through the mix. I tucked my hands into my coat pockets, the cold biting at my knuckles, and glanced at Dorian. Let's see how they act when the table turns. I murmured, my breath curling into the air like smoke. The cafe behind us hummed faintly as the neon light buzzed, and for the first time in years, the road ahead felt like something I could shape instead of just endure. The air in Dorian's law office carried the faint recycled chill of overworked air conditioning. The conference room smelled faintly of toner and lemon polish, as though someone had tried too hard to mask the sterile tension that always clung to these kinds of meetings. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, and one of them just above the end of the long oak table flickered at uneven intervals, throwing a soft, stuttering glow across the polished surface. "Mr. Thane, are you ready?" the receptionist asked softly, holding the door open as I stepped through. I gave her a brief nod, clutching the blue folder in my hand, the weight of it more grounding than heavy now. My palm pressed against its cool leather surface. As I walked to the head of the table, the faint squeak of my shoes breaking the otherwise taut silence. Claret sat 2 chairs down, her posture stiff, her smile brittle at the edges. She wore a pearl necklace I hadn't seen in years. Something Celeste had given her back when holidays felt warmer, more certain. Her fingers tightened slightly on the stem of her wine-colored pen. As I approached, though her gaze flitted anywhere but my face. Navon lounged with practiced ease at her side, his tailored jacket unbuttoned, a monogrammed pen, spinning idly between his fingers. He didn't bother to mask his smirk when he glanced up at me, the kind of look that suggested this was all a formality. One last bit of paperwork before the inevitable bending to his plans. Orrin sat further down his backpack, half-zipped at his feet. A couple of his textbooks spilled out just enough for the titles to show. One with its glossy spine tilted toward me read, Ethics in Modern Society. The irony sat heavy in the fluorescent light, though I didn't comment. He tapped his sneaker against the carpet, a muted rhythm betraying a nervousness He probably thought he was hiding well enough. Dorian entered last, his expression composed his suit, impeccable as always. He carried a slim binder tucked under his arm and gave me the faintest nod before taking his place at the far end near the flickering bulb. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone measured, not cold, but utterly neutral. The voice of a conductor bringing an orchestra to attention before the first note. "Today we'll review Mr. Thane's updated estate plans. Standard procedure. There will be time for questions and clarifications afterward." His eyes moved briefly to mine, a subtle cue, steady measured, no theatrics. The first few minutes passed with the dull murmur of legal formality, names, dates, notarizations read aloud. Nevin's pen spun lazily, as though this were background noise. Claret dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue, though no tears had yet fallen. Oren leaned forward, elbows on the table, glancing occasionally toward me but never holding my gaze for long. When Dorian nodded to me, I rose from my chair. The blue folder felt cool against my fingers as I set it gently on the table, the soft thud of leather on wood punctuating the hush that had settled over the room. Before we continue, I said, my voice even steady, "I want to make something clear. I am not gone. Not yet. And even when I am, my name will stand for something beyond these walls, beyond these conversations." Claret's lips parted slightly, a soundless intake of breath. Nevin's smirk faltered just for a flicker of a second before his jaw tightened. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed louder for a moment, casting a brief glare across his cufflinks. Oren's sneakers stopped tapping. I opened the folder just enough to slide out the top document, the finalized will, and the charter for the Celeste Thane Community Fund. 70%. I continued, placing the document flat where they could all see will go to the fund. To the programs Celeste and I envisioned years ago: mentorships, community resources, scholarships. The remainder will be divided, but only under clear conditions. Service accountability contribution. Nevin straightened the pen clutched tightly now instead of spinning. "This isn't what we discussed," he said, his tone controlled but edged like a wire pulled taut. "This isn't it's what's signed," I interrupted, my voice still calm, still even. "And it's final. You can contest it, of course, but Dorian will walk you through what that would entail." My hand stayed lightly on the folder fingers, tracing its spine, not possessively, but as a reminder to myself of the quiet weight it carried. Claret's tissue finally caught a tear, though her gaze stayed fixed on the document rather than anyone at the table. Oren's eyes flicked from me to the folder, his brows drawn tight, as though the reality of something beyond the easy narrative Nevin had spun was just settling in. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out toward the folder. His fingertips brushed the edge, but stopped there, resting on the cool leather without opening it, as though he knew some things needed time before they could be fully seen. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint rhythmic flicker of the fluorescent bulb above. Dorian closed his binder with a soft thump, his calm smile returning as he looked to the three of them. "We'll proceed with filing next week," he said smoothly, his voice wrapping around the room like a gavel's echo. "Unless, of course, there's a formal contest. But that would only complicate matters." I stayed seated, my hands still on the folder, as their gazes shifted between one another, searching for some silent consensus that wasn't there. The hum of the air conditioning filled the space, left by their words cool and constant, as I leaned back slightly in my chair and let the weight of the moment settle exactly where it belonged on their side of the table. The leaves along the path were brittle and loud underfoot each step, cracking like an old memory I wasn't entirely ready to hold. The air along the river carried the damp, earthy smell of bark and waterlogged soil, the kind of scent that clings to your coat long after you've left. The park was quiet except for the low rush of the current and the occasional cry of a gull circling somewhere overhead. I'd chosen this bench because it sat just far enough from the path that most people passed, without stopping a small pocket of quiet in a town that always seemed to hum with polite busyness. "You've made your point, Dad," Claret said, as she lowered herself beside me, the old wooden bench letting out a soft, drawn-out squeak beneath our combined weight. Her tone wavered between defense and fatigue, like someone who had rehearsed her lines too many times but couldn't quite make herself believe them anymore. The wind lifted the ends of her scarf, teasing the fringe across her shoulder. Ahead, a family of 4 strolled by along the gravel path. 2 small children bounding ahead, their laughter cutting through the cool breeze. Clarette's eyes followed them only for a second, but I saw at that flash of something softer, a flicker of memory or longing before she pulled her gaze back to the ground between her boots. She adjusted the sleeve of her coat, a nervous tick she's had since she was a teenager, and exhaled through her nose as though the leaves crunching around us were somehow responsible for the tension between us. "You think I wanted to push you out of your house?" she said finally. Her voice lower now, almost a murmur. "It wasn't just about the PTA or Nevin's ideas. I was worried about you, Dad. Alone in that place, drafts sneaking through the windows, the stairs creaking under you, I thought that I couldn't decide for myself." I interrupted softly, my hands folded loosely on my lap. My voice didn't rise, didn't harden, but the words settled heavy in the cool air. "You made your choices, Clarette. I made mine. That's how this works." She flinched slightly, though I wasn't sure if it was from my words or the sudden gust of wind that rattled through the trees overhead, shaking loose a few amber leaves that spiraled down around us. One landed on the bench between us, its edge-curled veins like a map of something too intricate to decipher at a glance. I leaned back, my gaze drifting toward the river where the late afternoon light caught on its rippled surface. Celeste's voice came to me unbidden, the way it sometimes does when I'm not trying to summon it. I could see her sitting at our kitchen table years ago, coffee cup in hand, her eyes fixed on me over the rim as she said, "Sometimes love isn't enough if respect isn't there. You can forgive almost anything, Gary, but not that. Not forever." Back then, it felt like a passing thought, something wise she'd say between bites of toast. Now it echoed louder than the rustle of the branches or the distant hum of traffic beyond the park. Clarette shifted beside me, the bench groaning softly again. "Maybe I should have said things differently," she admitted, her voice cracking just enough that it didn't sound like strategy anymore. Her hand moved hesitantly toward mine, her fingers brushing against my coat sleeve like she was testing the temperature of a pool before diving in. I pulled my hand back gently, not sharp, just enough to draw the line where it needed to be. "You don't need to explain," I said quietly, eyes still on the river. "You need to think about why you did what you did and what it cost." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind shifted, carrying the faint briny smell of the lake from further down the shoreline. The family from earlier had looped back, their laughter softer now as they walked farther away, their voices fading into the rustle of leaves. Clarette stood, the dry snap of a twig under her boot punctuating the silence like a reluctant period at the end of a sentence. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck, looked as though she might say something, then closed her mouth again. Her footsteps on the gravel path crunched in a slow rhythm as she walked away, the breeze tugging at the hem of her coat. I stayed seated, watching the river darken as the sun slid lower, the light fading to that pale silvery hue that comes just before evening swallows the day. My breath rose in small misty puffs, and the bench creaked as I leaned back, exhaling a long, slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Maybe the silence will teach them more than I ever could." I whispered the words, barely more than a thread of sound carried off by the wind. The current moved steadily below, leaves drifting along its surface, their paths quiet and unbothered by the noise we humans make, trying to prove our worth. The air held that sharp, crystalline cold particular to a Detroit winter, the kind that turns every breath into a brief curling ghost before it vanishes into the pale morning sky. Fresh snow covered the sidewalks in soft drifts, still mostly undisturbed, save for the neat lines cut by the city plows and the crunch of boots from the growing crowd. The red ribbon stretched taut across the wide double doors of the brick building, a bright slash of color against the frosted glass and the dark wood framing. "This building, it's beautiful," a girl no older than 12 whispered to her friend, her mittened hand pointing up at the new sign that gleamed above the entrance, Celeste Thane Community Center. The letters caught the weak winter sunlight, glowing faintly against the gray sky. I heard the awe in her voice and felt something shift, a quiet warmth threading through the cold that had long ago settled somewhere behind my ribs. I exhaled slowly, breath misting, and caught a prickle of awareness along my spine. Turning slightly, I saw Oren standing across the street near a lamppost, his hood pulled up, a notebook tucked under one arm. His expression was unreadable, neither defiant nor apologetic. He didn't wave or call out, just watched us stand still as the snow gathering along the curb. I held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the crowd gathering near the ribbon. This day wasn't about him. It wasn't about Nivan or Claret or any of the conversations that had left my voice hoarse over the past few years. Dorian stood beside me, his hands deep in the pockets of his wool coat, a faint smile curling beneath the gray at his temples. Big turnout, he murmured, his voice low enough that it didn't carry to the volunteers or city staff milling around us. His glasses caught a brief glint of light as he turned toward me. Celeste would have been proud. And so would the garrison I met 30 years ago, the one who knew how to hold a line when everyone else was ready to fold. I didn't answer right away, just let my gaze drift up to the sign again, to the way the bold lettering seemed to anchor the building to something greater than just steel and mortar. The hum of the crowd softened as I stepped forward toward the ribbon. The oversized ceremonial scissors, absurdly heavy in my gloved hands, gleamed against the subdued light. My thanks to all of you, I said, my voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the assembled group. For coming here, for believing in what this place will be. Celeste and I, we always wanted to build something that would last. Something with a purpose that could outlive the pain we all carry in one form or another. This center is that purpose. Not a monument, but a beginning. The words didn't need to stretch further than that. I brought the scissors down in one smooth motion, the blades biting clean through the ribbon. The sound of the crowd's applause echoed off the freshly painted brick, filling the wide street with something that felt warmer than the air allowed. A child, a boy no older than 10, tugged gently at the hem of my coat as the ribbon fell away. His small hand was warm, even through the thick wool. "Sir," he asked shyly, his breath puffing clouds, "is it true there'll be scholarships for kids like me?" I crouched slightly so I could meet his eyes, the faint scent of fresh paint and new wood drifting out from the open doors behind us. "It's true," I said, a quiet smile forming. "And you won't have to ask twice when the time comes." His grin, small and genuine, was answer enough before he ran off toward the other children, his boots thumping softly against the salted pavement. Inside, the main hall spread wide and tall, sunlight filtering through a panel of stained glass, near the far end scattering soft hues of amber and green across the polished floors. The applause from outside drifted in as a low rolling echo, mingling with the faint scent of varnish and clean wood. I walked slowly through the hall, my boots clicking softly each step, absorbing the reality that this was no longer just a plan on Dorian's desk or a folder locked in a safe. On the wall near the entrance behind protective glass, the blue folder rested on display. The leather had been cleaned, the torn corner mended with a subtle stitch, no longer a weapon or a wound, but a quiet testament to everything it had carried. A small placard beneath it read, simply, "Founding Documents of the Celeste Thane Community Fund." The light streaming through the stained glass shifted slightly as a breeze from the opening doors stirred the air. I turned, glancing back through the windows toward the street. Oren still stood across the way, the notebook now cradled in both hands. Our eyes met again, and for a brief moment neither of us moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded once. I felt my chin dip in reply, a gesture as quiet as the snowflakes beginning to drift between us. No words passed. None were needed. The applause continued outside, rising and falling like the breath of the city itself, and I turned back toward the hall, the faint colors from the stained glass painting the floor in shifting, living light. For the first time in a long while, the weight I carried felt lighter, not gone, but balanced by something greater than myself. I drew a deep breath, the scent of new beginnings mingling with the winter air, and let it out slow, steady, as the echo of the applause filled the space around me. The winter air outside still carried a trace of wood smoke. As I stood in the quiet hallway, my eyes lingering on the blue folder now resting behind glass, its torn corner neatly stitched and gleaming under soft light. It struck me how some things, like people, can be mended not to erase the break, but to make the cracks part of the story. I learned that justice isn't about revenge. It's about standing steady, even when those closest test your footing. Sometimes bridges collapse, so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. And even in late chapters of life, purpose can replace pain if we let it. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise?